Welcome to the LERA Best Papers Work in the Food Industry session. My name is Justin Vinton. I'm from Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. I'm the chair of the session. Today we have presentations by Jessica H.F. Hammerling, who's out of the University of California, Berkeley, and Hyesook Chung, who's out of Cornell University, Cornell. Unfortunately, Sophie Kelmenson will not be able to be with us today. So that actually gives us a decent amount of time on these two presentations. So we've actually done it the way that LERA recommended when we were moving to virtual. We have, I'm going to stream everything from the presentations from my computer. So I'm going to stream Jesse's presentation first and then Hyesook's, and then we can have time for plenty of discussion. So I'm going to share my screen right now and get started. If I can figure out how to do that. Here we go.
Justin, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I don't hear the voice from your computer, so.
I'm sorry. Give me 1 second. Sorry, what's wrong, Hyesook? Are you not hearing?
I don't hear a sound.
Oh, you don't hear?
I don't either.
Hear sound?
On the recording.
All right, that's odd. Let's see if I can do that again. My apologies. Oh, that's not right either.
Justin, you have to click the little arrow next to your mute button and switch the speaker. Instead of using the microphone on your earphone, use the computer, the device adapter. That will give you the sound of the YouTube channel.
Justin, so I'm just curious if you share the computer sound when you click the share screen. There's an option that you can click to obtain the option to share the computer sound.
It's still not working, Justin. Justin? It's still not working. I mean, I'm here, so I could just do it again live. I can't hear you either now.
Bernadette is here. She might be able to help. Bernadette?
I'm just curious if you could give us a sort of permission to be a co-host.
Of course.
Yeah, so that I can try.
Of course.
Yeah, for you.
Okay. There you go. Is that all you guys need?
Please give me a minute.
Site that they bring back to be performed by QMs workers, example, the maintenance work on machine or in the plant, and also in situ outsourcing, which is the phenomenon of allowing an external supplier to operate on site.
Are we waiting for Hyesook, or is there something else that you guys needed me to help with?
Management ideology on what is to be performed inside firms boundary or
We don't have any sound from you, Justin.
Yeah.
labor and management relationships. So it's mostly from the industrial.
If you click on the arrow right next to the microphone, it doesn't look like it's picking up from the right microphone.
Influence the boundary of the firm. Joint programs or local experiments are really important in that regard.
I'm a researcher at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and I'm a PhD. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessie Hammerling. I'm a researcher at the UC Berkeley Labor Center, and I'm a PhD candidate in geography at UC Davis. The research I'm going to talk about today is an in-depth qualitative case study looking at what's driving outsourcing for a particular type of domestic service industry, on-site cafeteria food services. The specific question I'm asking is, why do some firms choose to outsource food services rather than provide them in-house? What's interesting here is that there's fairly broad agreement in the literature. Everyone basically agrees that firms that choose to outsource do so because it's cheaper. Why might it be cheaper? Theories say that outsourcing reduces prices and increases efficiency, both by introducing competition into the supply chain and by improving efficiency through specialization. The business and econ literature agree. The standard thinking is that the advent of internet communications technology made it easier to coordinate actions across firms, changing firms' make or buy decision in favor of buy versus make. A slightly different, but not necessarily conflicting take on domestic outsourcing emphasizes institutional and regulatory changes that led to the dominance of shareholder-driven business models that favored outsourcing because of a perceived cost advantage. The costs of outsourcing are perceived to be less, and thus the returns to shareholders higher because competition reduces prices and because outsourcing removes workers from the client firm's internal wage and benefit structure, which tends to reduce their wages and benefits. So the big surprise in my research was that outsourced food services were not necessarily cheaper than in-house food services. And in many cases, key decision makers with outsourced programs were aware that outsourcing would or could be more costly. So why were they doing it? I'm going to walk through what I did and what I found, and then talk about what it means for our understanding of domestic outsourcing. So again, the question I'm asking is, why do some firms or organizations choose to outsource food services rather than provide them in-house? For these kinds of how and why questions, there are real benefits to digging in deep in a particular industry and region, talking to people to construct a more complete picture of the context and the factors that are influencing firm decision-making. The specific place of focus for my case study is the San Francisco Bay Area region, and I selected two types of cafeteria food service clients to compare: universities and tech companies. My methods involved in-depth interviews with industry experts and key stakeholders, and participation in industry meetings and conferences. The groups that I interviewed included contractor firms and client organizations, self-operator organizations, advocacy groups, industry experts, and consultants. I interviewed a total of 33 people across 29 different organizations. Some basics about the contractor industry, the food service contractor industry. The most important thing to know is that as a highly consolidated industry, there's basically 4 large food service contractors that control over 80% of the market in the US. That's Compass, Aramark, Sodexo, and Delaware North. They serve a wide range of clients. Corporate is one, also stadiums, convention centers, but institutional accounts are a bigger portion: education, hospitals, and prisons. These are really big ticket accounts because of their scale and because they tend to be longer term contracts. Consolidation has been a strong trend in the industry in recent years. Also, these large firms have been expanding into other types of facility services like laundry, janitorial, and security. Some basics about the tech company cafeterias. This is obviously pre-coronavirus. Most of the large and growing tech companies offer some food services. Often it's free. Corporate dining is not new, but it's become a bigger deal with the tech companies because of the free food they offer and because of the really lavish offerings at certain companies, which you may have heard about. Most of these companies outsource food from day one, but a few have self-operated but then outsourced their cafeterias as the companies grew. A handful of smaller companies still self-operate, but this seems to be fairly rare. The tech companies tend to view the free food programs as an important recruiting tool. It also helps keep workers on site throughout the day. Some basics about the university cafeterias. They are more of a mix of outsourced and self-operated. The University of California schools are self-operated. The California State University cafeterias are outsourced, and smaller and private schools tend to outsource. Santa Cruz and Davis insourced their programs in 2004 and 2017, and San Jose State University outsourced recently. So there is some movement back and forth here. This seems to track with national estimates. Larger schools are slightly more likely to self-operate, and there's some movement in both directions, but it's pretty mixed overall. Unlike at tech companies, students, and in many cases their parents, pay for the food. It's not subsidized, so budgets and prices are a big concern. So basically, I expected to find that companies and universities that outsourced were doing it to cut costs and/or improve efficiency. That's not what I found. In both cases, cost cutting did not appear to be the main motive for outsourcing food services, and there's reason to believe that in many cases the costs of outsourcing were higher, and that it wasn't necessarily more efficient compared to self-operating. So let's walk through each of these. On efficiency. For tech companies and smaller universities, the expertise and organizational infrastructure of a large food service contractor offered some advantages compared to self-operating. They have all these systems in place, so they can quickly come in and build a program. However, the size of these companies and the way they are run was arguably more of a burden than a benefit, according to many of the people that I interviewed. They have a ton of red tape, and the client said it was really hard to make changes to customize or adapt their programs to meet the needs of employees and students. One of the reasons it's so hard to customize is because in the business model of the contractors, supplier rebates are an important source of revenue, in a lot of cases more important than the sale of food. They get rebates from food suppliers like Tyson or Cisco for large purchases, so they have a big incentive to use certain products over others. These products are not necessarily the lowest cost or best quality. They are just the ones that can provide the biggest kickback to the contractor, so they tend to be from large consolidated supplier companies rather than smaller local companies. Some of the cost savings for these rebates may be passed on to clients, but the reality is that it's really impossible to tell. Clients can see certain kinds of bulk pricing reflected in the contracts, but not the back-end rebates, which are known as off-invoice rebates in the industry. Everyone knows this is happening, but all the big contractors do it, so there's not a lot of options out there for clients. So what about the cost of labor? I didn't do a wage survey, so I can't say for certain how wages compare for employees of contractors versus self-operators, but anecdotally, they seem to be lower for employees of contractors. At one tech company, a manager told me that all the kitchen workers went from earning around $20 to $25 an hour to $15 an hour when the company outsourced the cafeteria, plus the workers lost access to the tech company's generous benefits. Similarly, the wages and benefits for the UC cafeteria workers appear to be higher in most cases than at the outsourced smaller and private schools. So does that mean that the costs of labor are lower for outsourced food services? Not necessarily. According to several interviewees, some contractors charge the client more for labor than it actually costs them. Similarly to food rebates, they don't necessarily pass through group rate savings on things like health insurance, and they don't have to fully disclose their back-end accounting to the client, so it's very hard to tell. So if the efficiency isn't necessarily better, and the cost of food and labor may actually be higher in some cases with outsourced food services, why are almost all tech companies and many universities outsourcing rather than self-operating? The reasons were related, but distinct. For tech companies, the most important motivation to outsource rather than self-operate food services was to improve their financial metrics by reducing employee headcount. One of the key productivity metrics for tech companies is revenue, the ratio of revenue to employee headcount. Investors use this metric to assess how promising and productive a company looks, so they have a huge incentive to reduce headcount, especially for workers that don't contribute to revenue generation, but even for those who do. This is why, for the companies that went from self-operated to outsourced, they tended to do so in advance of issuing their IPO. I talked to someone at one of these companies and they said basically everyone knew that outsourcing the cafeteria would be more expensive and that the quality of food services would probably go down. The company made the decision to outsource purely based on the need to reduce headcount. As the company was getting ready to go public, they needed to get all of those people off payroll to reduce the headcount. And many different interviewees from different companies confirm this. What about universities? Here it is less of a foregone conclusion whether or not a university will outsource its cafeteria because both models are common, and schools will occasionally switch from one to the other. For the schools that decide to enter into or renew a food service contract, the main motivation to outsource rather than self-operate food services was to obtain financing for capital upgrades, such as new dining or residence halls, from the food service contractors. Here, too, people knew that outsourcing wasn't necessarily cheaper, but the food service contractor companies offer loans for new build-outs, and this was an important incentive that made the contract worthwhile to the school. Many people told me this at schools with in-house and with outsourced facilities. So do the benefits of financing outweigh the costs in the long run? Some schools clearly think so, but others say no. In particular, the UC schools that brought the programs back in-house report that the costs have gone down, student participation and satisfaction with the food service program has gone up, and in addition, wages and benefits for the workers who now have a union are better, and they didn't have to lay anyone off. It's worth noting that this calculation wasn't what actually brought the programs back in-house. It was activism from students and workers to improve working conditions of the cafeterias and to increase the environmental sustainability of the program. So what did we learn here? Clearly, the motives to outsource for both tech companies and universities is financial. But it's really interesting that the financial motives are separate from the actual cost of food services. I was pretty surprised by this. I expected the cost of outsourced food services to be lower, but that's not necessarily the case. Nor are they clearly more efficient or higher quality. So the reasons for tech companies and universities to outsource are different, but they are related. Both point to the increasing importance of financialization in the market for food services, financial metrics in the financial sector in the case of tech companies, and financial tools in the case of the loans from the contractor to the school. So just to wrap up, this study has enriched our understanding of the process of domestic outsourcing by demonstrating the importance of financial incentives in shaping organizations' decision-making about outsourcing food services and showing how these incentives can play out differently in different client markets. The conclusions I've drawn here should not be interpreted as a portrait of an industry in which contractors offer low-quality products and services at an extensive markup across the board. While some clients that I interviewed are dissatisfied with their food service contractor, many feel satisfied and some are very proud of their contracted cafeterias. Additionally, I spoke with clients and consultants who had worked successfully with contractors to improve programs that clients felt were underperforming. The purpose of this case study is instead to interrogate the way that the market for food services works and the factors that influence decision-making by clients, contractors, and self-operators. Doing so helps shine a light on the business models that are used by different actors and the kinds of financial incentives that are guiding operational practices. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. So I want to hold off some questions. If you have any questions, you can put them in the group chat, the message board here. Otherwise, please hold them until after all of the presentation. And since I can't figure out the audio on sharing my screen, Hyesook, would you be able to stream your presentation as well? And this is on precarious work schedule and its organizational outcomes.
Yes, I will do that.
Great, thank you. And I apologize for my technical issues.
Hello, my name is Hyesook Chung, a PhD candidate in the studies of human resources at IEL Law School, Cornell University. In this presentation, I will talk about variable work schedules, which are known as a common managerial practice in the food service and restaurant industry, and how these practices to manage the workforce affect employee turnover and store-level outcomes. Before going into details, I will briefly talk about the current trends and issues of the restaurant industry, which is the context of my research. The restaurant industry is one of the fastest growing sectors in the US economy. It's currently a $660 billion industry. As you can imagine, restaurants and other food service providers are so widespread that half of all adults have worked in food service in one way or another at some points in their lives. The restaurant industry employs almost 12 million people. According to the first National Employer Survey of Work and Human Resource Management in the US restaurant industry, conducted by Beth and her colleagues, high rates of employee turnover is very common. In this survey, managers reported that almost 1 in every 2 workers quits or is fired from their jobs each year. Also, most jobs are low paid with few benefits and career advancement opportunities. A noticeable characteristic of the job is that workers in the industry tend to experience unpredictable, precarious work schedules. Because work schedules are highly related to the quality of jobs and financial insecurity, the issue of scheduling has recently gotten attention from the media, academics, and policymakers. So, I focus on this temporal aspect of employment relations and how variable work schedules can affect not only employees' turnover behaviors, but also unit-level outcomes. Prior studies have shown that variable work schedules can negatively affect employee well-being through diverse individual-level mechanisms such as sleep quality, stress, and anxiety, as well as work-family conflict. So we have empirical evidences connecting work schedule variability to individual level outcomes. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that variable work schedules hurt the unit level or organizational level outcomes. In fact, managers often believe that variable work schedules increase profits because it allows them to match labor to variable customer traffic or demands. In other words, practitioners consider having labor flexibility through variable work schedules beneficial for store efficiency. So here we see the tension between what employers believe is good for unit performance and what is good for employees. Given that the decision over work schedule is mostly driven by employers, not employees, this unstable work schedule can often impose burdens on employees. However, we have limited evidence as to whether this variable work schedule actually improves the unit level outcomes such as profits or customer satisfaction. In this study, I tackled this issue asking the following question: how and why do variable work schedules affect unit level outcomes? I predict that variable work schedules will be negatively related to store profits, customer satisfaction, and employee retention. Why can this be the case? I posit that if a store is populated by employees with variable work schedules, workers in the focus store are more likely to experience constant changes in work context and reshuffling of work group membership. This will subsequently deter the emergence of stable co-work experience or co-work relationships among employees. The consequence is twofold. First, unstable work group experience can hinder collective learning and the development of transactive memory system, both of which demand iterative mutual sharing of tacit knowledge by working together. Second, unstable work group membership can weaken social relational ties or mutual embeddedness between employees, which can lower the store's capability to retain its employees. I tested my predictions using data obtained from 2018 stores of a restaurant company in the US. I investigated work schedules of over 90,000 workers from the stores for 2 years. I was able to track granular work hours histories based on the punch machine records rather than self-report. In this organization, the store managers have overall discretion for workforce planning, including employee hiring and scheduling. This is an example of work schedule data. As you can see here, there is a unique identifier for each employee, and for every day on which a focal employee worked, I can track her position and minute-level daily work schedule. Let me explain the independent variable first. At the unit level, I estimated the extent to which workers in their store experience variable work schedules. I measured it with different approaches such as average standard deviation of work hours, instability ratio used by prior researchers like Lambert, and coefficient of variation. Although these measures are somewhat differently operationalized, all of them capture the average degree of fluctuation of employee work schedules of the store. For the dependent variables, I examined 3 things: collective turnover, customer satisfaction, and financial performance of the store. To derive the collective turnover rate, I divided the number of employees who left the focal store during the month, both full-time and part-time workers, by the total number of employees who worked for the store for the month. For the financial performance, I used the monthly profits made by each store. Customer satisfaction was reported by a customer survey. I included a set of controls like the store size, the proportion of full-time workers, gender proportion, the average age, and the total number of hours worked for the store. These are the descriptive statistics and correlations from 45,000 store month pairs. For analysis, I used the store fixed effects panel regression with robust standard errors. Time invariant store-specific unobserved variables are parceled out in these models. Results were consistent with the random effects models. Also, the results were consistent across the three measures of work schedule variability. In this presentation, I report the effect of store average standard deviation of work hours. As expected, a store with variable work schedules has higher turnover rates and lower store profit and customer satisfaction than its counterpart. One standard deviation increase in average store work schedule variability led to roughly 1% increase in monthly turnover rate, a $1,000 decrease in monthly profits, and 0.6 decrease in average customer satisfaction. This study has several implications. First, the findings imply that despite the common belief shared by practitioners, variable work schedules can be detrimental for the store or organizations, even from the perspective of employers, not just from employees' point of view. Second, this study suggests work schedule variability can be a meaningful predictor of not just individual turnover, but also turnover at a unit level. Thus, there exist conditions under which stable work schedules can be a win-win strategy for both employers and employees. This study is in progress, so I'm collecting data on business dynamism or customer demand fluctuation faced by each store to measure the extent of flexibility pressures. As noted earlier, practitioners often believe that fluctuating customer demand justifies the use of variable work schedules because it can increase volume flexibility of the store. Interestingly, early analysis of this data shows that the opposite is the case, suggesting that variable work schedules tend to be more negatively related to the store performance under highly fluctuating customer demands. Finally, I will examine whether the use of variable work schedules indeed increases the organizational flexibility. To do so, I'm in the process of collecting data on customer traffic and performance restoration after the recent pandemic. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions and feedback. I hope you stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hyesook. So now we have about 25 minutes for open discussion. So please feel free to raise your hand or however you want to signal that you have a question. I see we already have some interest in Jesse's presentation, and I know you already answered here, but maybe you want to speak to everyone. The question was from Peter. Did you find any organizational characteristics associated with which financial metrics were most salient to decision makers? If you want to expand on that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so for tech companies, this revenue to headcount metric is definitely the most important metric. It came to bear on the outsourcing decision for the few companies that ever had an in-house cafeteria, which was a small handful, but some big names that you'd recognize. But they made the decision to outsource pre-IPO. So this question tended to come up more for younger companies as they're getting ready for their IPO, they're trying to get their financial metrics in order and really look appealing to investors. I mean, this metric, I think, continues to be important, but they've already made the, if they're outsourced from day one, they've already made the decision. So it's not really a question whether they're going to bring these people back in-house if they could save a little bit of money. And then for the universities around here in the Bay Area, in my sample, it tended to be the smaller schools that were more likely to outsource. And partly, I think that's because the UC schools, there was, a coordinated student and union-led campaign to bring the programs back in-house. And I think there's probably some slight cost differentials. It was sort of an easier question as a bigger institution. It was maybe logistically easier for them to in-house, and that the smaller schools had more of a need or more of an advantage from seeking out that financing. But it also had to do with leadership change. So one of the schools that outsourced recently had a change in leadership. And what I heard from some folks in the industry, some of the consultants and food service program managers, was that that when new leadership will come in to run a school, they want to do something big and flashy, like build out a new cafeteria or a new residence hall. And so they have to raise money really quickly to do that. And an easy way to get that financing right away is by outsourcing a program like cafeterias so that they can get the big loan.
Great, interesting. Another question from Peter for Hyesook is, I wonder if you have considered how the choice of different timescales might influence the measurement and relationship between instability and productivity and profitability. So Hyesook, if you'd like to answer that.
Sorry, maybe I could just elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, sure. If you want to speak, yeah, that's better than me reading it.
Yeah, because this is something that I think was a really key finding that came out of this study Susan Lambert led that I worked on. And I think oftentimes there's an assumption, and really, Jesse, your presentation was getting at this as well. There's an assumption that these sorts of lean or, labor cost cutting business strategies are more efficient. And that assumption is often not, it's seldom tested empirically. And so it's really exciting to see, studies in multiple contexts that are trying to really drill down and understand how that assumption might be ill-founded, or it might depend on what metrics you're really focusing on. So one thing that seems relevant in the retail case that I've been studying is that the shorter the time span over which you're assessing efficiency, say your ability to satisfy customer traffic with minimal labor hours. If you're focused on a very short time period, matter of hours or days, that calculation might look different than if you're able to extend it to, say, the month or the quarter, and sort of take a longer term view towards how you might overshoot in some periods, but make up for that, by being able to adequately staff during busy periods. So I just wonder whether your choice of the month was sort of something that was just convenient with the data, or whether you looked at other time scales.
Thank you. It's a good question. So I think I believe you're referring to the research done by Lambert. And so as you suggested, we have different options like days and weeks and months. So I would expect that the effect can be clearer or more salient with longer time horizons. Because one of the key mechanisms I use is knowledge sharing, or long-term learning and collective experience learning among employees. So I think it takes time for this kind of learning effect to manifest. So with longer time frame, I think I expect to observe more robust effect in terms of productivity or even collective turnover. So I think I have other skills as well. So I think, as you suggested, maybe I can do sort of sensitivity analysis, which is not reported here, but I got consistent results. So hoping that this answers your question. And
It's,
yeah,
it's
even
partly
here,
about sensitivity.
yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say it's less about sensitivity, but about sort of understanding how what the managers are focused on might be different from the sort of longer term view that you're applying.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you.
Jesse, did you want to respond to that as well, or we can move on to the next question?
Yeah, actually, I did think that was really interesting. And I was wondering, Hyesook, if you could talk a little bit more about, like, yeah, to what extent are they aware? Like, how strong is this belief among managers that it would increase their profitability? You know, that flexible scheduling is advantageous? Because I think that's a really interesting part. This sort of follows up on Peter's point that, you know, to what extent are managers, what metrics are they really aware of? What are the assumptions and who holds these assumptions? And to what extent are they able to measure, or are they measuring it by different things? Because what I found in mine is that, you know, not only are they not really able to measure cost and efficiency super carefully, but they all sort of know it's not more, like the people who are actually involved with managing the programs know that it's not more cost effective to outsource, but that's not really what they're focused on, or that's not the outcome that they care about.
Okay, we can move on to the next question. Laura Carver, do you want to ask the question yourself, or I could just read it? It's up to you. So, yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much, Hyesook. So I was kind of just curious how you systematically dealt with issues of reverse causality. So I think if you could speak to that generally, I'd be curious to hear what analytical approaches you took.
So your question is about reverse causality, right? Yeah, thank you for asking. So I see your concerns. Actually, when I analyze data, I use the sort of lag dependent variables using, let's say, time to profitability. So after using that variable schedule, how the store profits and turnover change after that. So I know, and this is not exactly address the reverse causality issue, but you know, statistically, I try to kind of address the issue. But I think, yeah, you're right that it's interesting to look at maybe store profit can affect the managerial behavior to change their schedule.
Great. Another question for Hyesook. Did you examine supervisor discretion in scheduling, and in particular, the impact of algorithmic scheduling systems?
So I think it's a good question. So I didn't have sort of a specific measure to see the supervisor's discretion in scheduling, but I actually had interviewed with the managers there, and also according to the recent report about schedule control based on the National Longitudinal Survey of the Youth, and then what it says is that hourly workers for definitely dominant in retail and food service industry reported that less than 5% of them decided work schedule freely. So I would say flexible work hours have a different meanings to workers depending on who has control over work schedules, and especially in this food service industry, I would say definitely managers and supervisors have more control over scheduling than workers. And I think it's interesting to know sort of technology, sort of algorithm scheduling systems, and how this kind of technology can impact on scheduling system also. But I don't have that data yet.
Great. There's another question regarding state labor laws and how that can impact your results. Ting Ting, I'm not sure if you want to expand on that.
Sorry, I'm just kind of like a general question. I was thinking about the institutional factors. So the stringency of the state law, labor laws, or the political orientation, right? Like this also applies to Jess's case. If if we have the same settings but not in California, what would things be different? That's just my kind of like a general question to both of the presenters.
Yeah, I can start. I think the main way that we would see the regional impact, or at least the outcomes that I'm interested in is in the unionization rate and looking at worker impacts of outsourcing versus in-house production. There's more unions present. I mean, the in-house universities are all unionized, but some of the outsourced cafeterias are unionized as well. And so how that affects being outsourced affects the bargaining power of those unions. And for the tech companies, it's more a question of their ability to sort of have a union in the first place. I am not aware of any examples of tech companies that have in-house unions, but several now have, quite a few actually, and a growing number have outsourced cafeterias that are unionized. So I think that's something that's regionally quite different, but I think the dynamics that I observed in terms of the question about why to outsource are not site specific. Partly because it's the same contractor companies everywhere, because their ownership is so consolidated nationwide.
Great. I think Rose has a question.
Yeah, I just have a comment. I mean, both of these papers are fabulous, really careful, empirical work, qualitative, quantitative. And what I really like is both kind of challenge conventional wisdom. That we've talked about this, but it's really nice to see that backed up with very, very solid evidence, rigorous research design, et cetera. And then the other thing I think is getting beyond, thinking about managerial goals purely in profit terms, like short-term profits. We're very used to saying, oh, it's short-term profits that matter, short-term profits. And bringing in the argument around financialization is so important because there are all sorts of financial shenanigans that companies are playing now, and trying to understand their financial strategies as part of business strategy is really, really important. And the fact that, you've got this underlying story about loans and underlying story about IPO, and what it really is about is just improving your the way your financials look. I think that's all really headed in the right direction and gets us beyond this kind of very small, short-term, long-term kind of story about business strategy and the profit motive. So I really think that that's very powerful. And then for Hyesook, I really think it's powerful that there's been so much research on employee well-being and movements against all this unpredictable scheduling. But I don't think there is anyone that really has taken on the idea that variability and hyper flexibility is good for business. And that also is a really important dimension that hasn't been examined very closely. So I think both of these papers are really on the right track and will make big contributions. So keep it up.
Thanks.
Great. I actually have a question for Hyesook, and this is related a little bit to what Rose said more broadly, is we see a lot of these flexible work arrangements used by progressive companies now and kind of touting their benefits, especially right now in the age of COVID and the pandemic and moving virtual. Do you see this impacting areas outside of food service or service in general, or is it kind of maybe isolated in a specific industry because of the scheduling system and just the way work is performed?
Yeah, I think it's a valid question. So I think you're right that, in some industries, for example, like technology or professional workers driven industries, workers might have more discretion over their schedule. So if this is the case, it is possible that they are satisfied with the fact that they can adjust work schedule based on their needs. However, at the same time, even if we take into account employee control over work schedules, it is still not clear how this kind of fluctuating work schedules across employees affect team or group level, higher level processes, especially when the team requires coordination and collaboration among employees. So my guess is that even when employees have almost perfect discretion over their schedule, at the team and organizational level, maybe coordination and collective learning experiences working together is more likely to be disrupted by variable work schedules. So I think it would be interesting to see how flexible work schedules, even driven by employees in other industries, affect work processes and routines, I think.
Great. There's another question from Ting Zhang. What are the rationale for flex schedules? It seems contradictory with customer satisfaction. Feel free to jump in if you want to rephrase your question or.
Yeah, just because when you had the literature review, when you're talking about the counter argument of the rationale of flex schedule, you cite a literature basically talking about the demand required flex schedule. However, your findings noted that you actually have the negative impact on the customer satisfaction. So I kind of wondering, naturally, right? What are the other rationales, or if the only rationale for flex schedule is related on demand, why your findings the customer satisfaction is negative? So any explanation on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I think my focus is kind of learning by working together. So sort of community learning. So flexible, work may, so sorry. So are you asking about the rationale about how this kind of schedule can affect customer satisfaction, right?
Kind of, but more importantly, because your background literature is talking about the important rationale for flex schedule is because demand, which is customer driven, right? However, your findings noted that it is negative impact on customer satisfaction. So I think it probably some explanation at least, or maybe some literature missing, or some kind of, because if you test one direction, there got to be a counter argument or rationale for the history of flex schedule. Probably there are other rationales and missing link here. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think I need to dig deeper into about the mechanisms of why these kind of flexible work schedules can negatively affect customer satisfaction. I think it's a good point. So I'm thinking about sort of growth processes. So maybe it might increase sort of customer waiting time. So I'm also looking into when customers are really, the busy time, during the busy time, workers kind of work process is not efficient, so that the customers might wait longer time. So that could be sort of mechanism I can explain, but yeah.
Great. Any other questions, comments? If not, I have one for Jesse. You talk about the reasons why these companies would outsource or not, depending on their size. Did you see any reasoning that the universities or tech companies decide to do this, being that shifting accountability to, for health and safety? And you mentioned that quality of food may be impacted by these decisions. Maybe if you could just speak to that, if that was maybe a reason. I mean, you'd think that might be.
Yeah, I think that wasn't, that didn't seem to be a motivating factor, but it was definitely a benefit of outsourcing. Not having to both the liability for like, you know, for workers' comp or just for paying their benefits generally. There was sort of this idea that like, okay, they're not our problem anymore. We don't have to worry about like long-term health insurance costs or workers' comp or any of that if it's another company. So that was an advantage, but the sort of the knowledge among the people who actually were running these programs that was still going to cost them a lot more money was just so interesting to me. So that overrode that. So it wasn't the deciding factor. But I think the other thing, you know, that we haven't talked about, that's kind of another implication and like a follow-up portion of the research that I would want to dig into more, is the sort of how the dynamics of outsourcing and the motivations to outsource in the food services industry in particular reinforce the market consolidation among the food service contractors themselves. So there was definitely an incentive for the tech companies, for instance. They would much rather contract with a very large company that could easily cover its own liabilities rather than a small company for which they might still be held liable for a workers' comp claim, because that's obviously a big deal in kitchens. So they were like, great, if we can just hand this off to a company and we know that we're not going to get sued or sort of be held in joint liability if this small company can't cover its costs in the event of a lawsuit, they're like, great. So it was definitely a bonus. I wouldn't say it was the deciding factor, but it was absolutely a benefit of outsourcing, is just feeling less responsible for these people. And there was also a perception among the tech companies that, like, you know, part of this has to do with just norms and attitudes, where like people in the tech world in particular, like, well, these food service contractors, you know, they're not, like, of course they're not employees of the tech company. So it would be ridiculous for them to be getting these benefits that we're getting. You know, if it starts out that way, then it's like, oh, well, that, you know, at one of the companies that was in-house, they did get the benefits. And if you start out that way, then people have that as their expectation. But if it's not their expectation, then they say, oh yeah, no, like somebody who works in the kitchen shouldn't have, you know, I don't know, get a free laptop or travel credits or stock options or whatever.
Gotcha. Interesting. Very interesting. We still have about 3 minutes if anyone wants to have any thoughts or closing remarks. Well, if not, we can definitely continue this discussion and anything that comes up, any questions that people have on the discussions forum. I'm pretty sure Lera will be leaving that up there after the conference. So please feel free to comment and continue on with this conversation. This is great. These are great papers from Hyesook and Jesse. So I want to give you guys a round of applause. Thank you so much. Sorry for my own technical difficulties. I thought I had that figured out. The whole reason of doing this, having them pre-recorded, was to minimize these issues, and it still didn't work. But anyway, thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the good questions, and thanks for moderating, Justin.
Yeah.
Yeah.